Welcome to everybody who is here with us today. My name is Sue McKenna, and in the room I see that we also have Stephanie Burton with us. And between us, myself and Stephanie, I run the Enabling Quality Postgraduate Education project, which is funded by UCDP, and Stephanie runs the Community of Practice for Postgraduate Education, which is funded by University South Africa. And together we just try to provide platforms for conversations about all things to do with postgraduate studies. Now, today we're going slightly off agenda in the sense that we're talking about postdoctoral fellows. But given that many of our postgraduate scholars on graduation seek postdoctorates, and the postdoctorate is becoming a very significant part of the higher education landscape, we thought it was really important to have this session. And so joined with us today is Francois van Schalkwyk from Stellenbosch University, who was largely, in fact, you can tell us perhaps a bit about the process, but who was largely responsible for putting together the guidelines on the appointment, retention, and development of postdoctorates. Certainly a very interesting topic, and one that I see there have been a number of news articles and academic articles on both what a postdoc makes possible for both the candidate, the fellow, and for the university, but also the many constraints that many of these postdocs complain about. So we're really looking forward to your session. Thank you so much for being with us, Francois. Over to you.
Thanks, Sue. I've put my camera on as well. I'll try and share my screen in a short while. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. I think it's a given that this is ongoing work, that we have a set of guidelines doesn't mean that all issues are resolved and everything is clear. So it's important, I think, to have these sessions, bring as many people into the conversation as possible. And I think this is an ideal opportunity to do that. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm going to present a little bit of data because I think it's useful for us just to have a bit of context about what's happening with postdocs in South Africa. I'll try not to belabor the point, but just give a little bit of context, and then talk about the guideline process, which is very short, and then talk a little bit about the guidelines and what they hope to achieve, and one or two sort of hot topics that keep coming up when we have any of these kinds of sessions. So maybe also a disclaimer, I'm a postdoc. I'm in my 6th year, which according to some is not allowed. I disagree. It depends on how you read the USEF policy, and that's part of the problem, is that it's open to interpretation. And I think because I was a postdoc, I became aware of many of the issues that ultimately we had to deal with and try and provide some guidance in the guidelines. So I will try and share my screen. Let's see if that works. Let's put that into presentation mode. So I can't see anything now except my screen. Can you see everything clearly?
Francois, we can't see your screen share.
Okay, let's try again. Let's see this one, share.
Got it.
Okay, let me just put it in presentation mode. Okay. So, I mean, maybe just to start with the obvious, and maybe not so obvious, is to define what a postdoc is. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there isn't a universal definition. That while Sue's right, postdocs are becoming increasingly institutionalized as part of the academic workforce. Their position does differ from context to context. Certainly postdocs in other countries, particularly in Europe and the US, are expected to do a lot more teaching. In South Africa, that's definitely not so much the case. The focus is far more on research. So defining exactly what a postdoc is not that easy, but there are two aspects that most agree on. One is that there generally is a research component, and the idea is to enhance professional skills and research independence. You could say this doesn't sound that different maybe from a PhD, but I suppose it's an extension of that independence, and obtaining a grant, for example, is something you wouldn't necessarily do as a PhD, but might be expected to do as a postdoc, and so you'd be expected to be fairly independent and develop some autonomy in that process. And maybe the professional part is a little bit different. Of course, we do have the professional PhD now, or doctorate, so there's already a focus on professional, but professional skills, I think here means not skills that are only limited to academia, but skills that are transferable into the broader marketplace. And generally, across the world, a postdoc is a fixed term or temporary appointment. It's hardly ever a permanent position. It's a bridge between being a PhD, having obtained your PhD, and entry into academia or into the broader labor market. Duration can vary anything from 6 months to 3 years, and of course, as I said, in my case, 6 years, but that's because it's 3 times 2. You keep getting renewed contracts, so the full duration can be longer, but normally a contract is 6 months to 3 years. And the important part is, we know, it's not in full-time employment, and we'll come back to that later on in the presentation. So here I'm just trying to identify some of the main discourses or themes that emerge when people talk about this postdocs, particularly in the South African context. There's often talk of the competitive edge. Universities are becoming increasingly competitive, not just with each other in South Africa, but of course globally, as global rankings and other measurement instruments capture the imagination of university leaders, and postdocs are seen as a way of providing additional competitiveness to those universities, mainly by building additional research capacity. Lecturers, and particularly in South Africa, lecturers and professors may be stretched with their existing commitments, and bring in postdocs to enhance their research productivity or capacity at the university. There's also talk of augmenting supervisory capacity. This one always surprises me because it's quite strong when you read DSI and NRF documents, but is fairly weak when you get to the institutional level. And from surveys we've done, we know that they're very mixed results in terms of how much supervision postdocs can do. And it's a tricky one, because on the one hand, they're not permanent, and so that's what the institution will use as a reason for not allowing postdocs to supervise. But on the flip side, they have the expertise, at least having finished their own PhD, to provide supervision, especially if you think that in South Africa, I think at the moment only 48, maybe close to 50% of full-time academic staff have PhDs. So there's a shortage in supervision capacity, and at a national level, postdocs are seeing as augmenting that supervisory capacity. And then the one we're all familiar with, because of our unique publication subsidy scheme, postdocs are also seen as a means of increasing output, research output, and mainly in the form of publications. This slide just shows you the increase in postdocs over time. This data comes from various sources, mainly from the R&D survey, but also from a survey done by CREST for the NRF. And data shows, what is unsurprisingly quite a sharp increase in the number of postdocs in the South African system, but with some tailing off post 2017, apologies. The reason for that is not abundantly clear. It is a period after the student protests. Whether that discouraged international postdocs could be one reason, but we'd need more data over a longer period of time to see whether this is an actual trend. Just by comparison, if you look at the growth, it's comparable with Finland and China over the period to the last 10 years or so. So we're not an anomaly in that sense, although those are 2 very select countries. This slide shows the change over time in the age bands of postdocs, and what it really alerts us to is that the postdoc cohort is getting older. Effectively, the 41 to 50-year band is increasing. and that's at the expense of a younger band, which is 21 to 23. There, again, could be various reasons for this. One is more postdocs in the social sciences and humanities than was the case in the past. And we know that social sciences and humanities PhDs graduate post 40. So if they then go on to do postdocs, they will pull the average up. Whereas in the natural sciences, the postdocs might tend to have been younger. That's, to my mind, probably the most likely explanation for the change, but there could be others. This graph just shows the per capita output. So we collected from the survey, a whole lot of postdocs. We had their names, and we could then cross-reference them to the publications database that we have to try and assess what their publication outputs are. And you can see over time it's sort of settled at 2, makes sense from a kind of experience perspective, because we know that many, but not all, agreements with postdocs are that they produce around 2 articles per year. So this seems to confirm that. And what about the policy landscape? So we know that it's not always clear where the rules and regulations come from that determine how postdocs should be treated at universities. And this slide basically gives a little summary of that. So some universities have their own postdoc policies. I've managed to find 11 of them. There may be more, and I'm aware of some being drafted, some being revised. But certainly at institutional level, there's some guidance on how postdocs should be appointed and various procedures related to postdocs. But the main document that determines how postdocs are treated at universities at the moment is what is referred to as a SARS binding class ruling. So in 2013, USAF, which is University of South Africa, which represents all universities in the country, applied to SARS for a special ruling. And that's what the binding class ruling is. And it states that what they refer to as PDRFs, postdoctoral research fellows, are treated as bursary recipients. And as bursary recipients, they are exempt from paying tax. So any remuneration or any amount paid to a postdoc is tax exempt, and they may not be not seen as employees of the university. Now, I think what is less clear or obvious sometimes is that the binding class ruling, and there's just a screenshot of page 1 of the most recent binding class ruling, is revised every 5 years. The last one was in 2020 in June, and so I think we are in June 2025 now, so there should be a new binding class ruling being issued. I'm not sure that that's actually happened, but the binding class ruling is only for every 5 years, and so it is important that universities comply with the binding class ruling, because it could fall away, and then the whole landscape in terms of how postdocs are treated at universities would change overnight, basically. So what I was saying is that what many people don't realize is that the binding class ruling refers to the USAF PDRF policy, which is an annexure to the binding class ruling, annexure 2. And it has various stipulations in terms of how postdocs should be appointed, the advertising process, the disciplinary process, all sorts of things are covered there. But it's not a document that's widely known. I don't know if there are any people on USAF from the call, and I don't mean this in a horrible way, because I completely empathize, but I had someone from USAF email me and ask me for the USAF policy. So it's not a document that even USAF is fully aware of or has been using, and certainly not the community of practice. But it does exist, and it is certainly referred to in the binding class ruling. So it remains a relevant document. Nevertheless, what we found when we hosted postdoc forums in the past, there have been 3 of them, if I remember correctly, 2 at Stellenbosch, 1 at UNISA. When the community of practice came together and were discussing issues related to postdoc, it was clear that there were a lot of inconsistencies and confusion around postdoc matters. And this led us to decide to develop a set of guidelines. We didn't want to develop it as a policy, as a national policy. We didn't have the authority to do that anyway, but we acknowledge that, you know, things are different at universities, contexts differ. So to set policies might have been received as a bit prescriptive, and that's why we framed it as a set of guidelines that can help universities to develop their own policies, but at least to start to introduce some standardization and consistency and common understanding around particularly some of the more complicated issues related to postdocs. And so that started the process of developing what was eventually titled New Guidelines for the Appointment, Retention and Development of Postdoctorates. I'm not going to talk to this too much, but this just shows the process as we mapped it out, that we had a community of stakeholders. They identified a particular policy issue, which was the appointment and retention of postdocs. Effectively, a self-organized group emerged to form a consultative forum. We did draft working papers, made presentations, consulted widely, and then produced the draft sets of guidelines. This involved in-person meetings. We had the document available as a Google Doc for a while so that people could make comments. I think we received over 100 comments. And all this resulted ultimately in a set of guidelines, the first draft of which was released last year in June. So it's been more than a year that it's been in circulation. And maybe it's time to revisit and update that. That's something that might emerge from this discussion. So this is what it looks like. The guidelines, in terms of structure, it deals with 14 different areas, if you will. It's available for download on Zenodo as an open access document. The idea that, you know, universities or anyone who needs it can access it easily, use it as a reference. If we look at the structure, you'll see it starts with the purpose of the guidelines, but also the purpose of the doctorate. And I think that's something that we're still grappling with. As I said earlier, many see the purpose as purely research. We know that postdocs we know this from the survey, that postdocs also want teaching experience. The reason for that is twofold. One, if they enter into academia in South Africa, they see that teaching experience is valuable, because they will probably have to take on some teaching responsibilities. And secondly, for mobility reasons. If they want to move to take up a postdoc position in Europe or the US, they are expected to teach. And I've certainly had this experience where you want to apply for a post and then it asks if you're teaching portfolio, philosophy, etc. And you have none because it's not something that postdocs are often encouraged or permitted to do in the South African context. So purpose is important. I already touched on supervision. Is that the purpose of one of the purposes of the postdoc is to enhance supervisory capacity? That remains unresolved too. So there's still, I think, a lot of tension in terms of what the actual purpose of the postdoc is, which then obviously leads on to what those functions are. You can set out specific functions. It deals with the organizational structures within the different universities, who takes responsibility for what. And maybe just to point out there the importance of the hosts of the postdocs. And in the development of the guidelines, we didn't only consult with the administrators and postdocs themselves, but also we had 2 workshops with hosts to get their input, because hosts are really the sort of the anchor point in the institution for the postdoc. There's often very little other place or space or structure that will take care of the postdoc on a day-to-day basis. So hosts play an incredibly important part in this postdoc experience. And then it deals with things that you would expect, you know, appointment process. There are very clear guidelines in the USAF documents about how you have to advertise for postdoc positions. And we deal with tenure, renewal, termination, remuneration and benefits, additional work, which comes up quite a lot, especially for postdocs who were able to do work as PhD or master students and are unable to work because of visa regulations. That is a big issue. Research outputs and other activities, induction and facilities, professional development, code of conduct, and review of the policy. So there are long, well, hopefully not too long, sections of dealing with each of these. And as I said, these are set out as guidelines rather than as prescriptive. We also, in the guidelines, indicates where each of the recommendations comes from, and also if there's a conflict. So there's a little icon which will say that the guideline deviates from the SARS binding class ruling and from the USF policy. So this is based on input that we received during the consultative process, that actually there's disagreement with how the binding class ruling and the USF policy set out a particular point. Where it refers to SARS, it indicates that this particular guideline complies with the binding class ruling. Same for USAF, where it complies with the USAF policy. And then also important and not necessarily overlooked, but maybe not always easy to access and understand is Department of Home Affairs and its guidelines, particularly in respect of non-South African postdocs. So I'm not going to go through the guidelines. It's not my intention, and it's available online, and I'm going to assume that people on this call have had a chance to access it and read through it and will have questions. And I'd much rather we have discussion around certain points than me going through a very tedious process of describing each one. But I did think I would touch on two topics that come up very often, discuss them briefly, and then I'd open up the floor and we can have a discussion rather than ongoing presentation. So for me, the two burning issues that always come up are remuneration and employment conditions of postdocs at universities and visas. So if we put those into context, this is from survey data that we collected, and we asked postdocs to indicate the amount of remuneration that they received, and you can see that predominantly it's in the 200 to 299,000 rand per annum bracket, followed by 300,000 to 399,000, and I think that's probably where most postdocs would identify, and certainly what the NRF offers. And I know at certain institutions where they have policies that stipulate what the remuneration amount should be, they would fall within those brackets. Nevertheless, you can still see that they are 10% below 200,000. I always keep a beady eye out for postdoc ads, and I see, postdoc positions advertised for 180,000 per annum, which I think falls well below what the guideline recommends. I think it is important to say, though, that the context does matter. We don't want to be too prescriptive about what the rate of remuneration should be. It doesn't cost the same to live in Bloemfontein as it does to live in Stellenbosch. We know that. So, cost of living is a big factor in the remuneration. So I think there is an argument to be made for some flexibility, but I think a minimum amount should be stipulated at an institutional level. There's also an argument that they should be capped, that there should be a maximum amount. Again, there are two sides to this argument. There are those that argue that some postdocs are earning more than professors, and I know that to be true at Stellenbosch University, for example, and that creates some tension. These are postdocs that are often funded by industry and obviously doing important work that is valued by that particular funder, but it doesn't mean that they earn a substantial amount that is tax-free. I know that at one university they capped the postdoc amount at 450,000 per annum, and then anything over and above that they taxed. That's not strictly in compliance with the binding class ruling, but you can see where the thinking comes from, that there should be some kind of cap to what a postdoc earns. So just to add, there are no statistically significant differences among fields that we found. When we asked them whether income was adequate, about 60% said yes, but at the same time, 78% indicated that they're unable to save based on their income. We collected qualitative open-ended questions from the survey, and many of them refer to a low rate of remuneration, but also the variation in remuneration, I think, is something that postdocs really struggle with. We also asked them whether they would like to be taxed and have benefits or remain tax exempt as they currently are. And it was a 45-40 split, so not much to choose. Seems divided. And we should add that I think one thing around where there's a misunderstanding is that because postdocs are tax exempt doesn't mean that they cannot receive benefits from the university. The important part is that postdocs must not look like they are employees from SARS's point of view. So a postdoc cannot be on a staff pension fund, for example, but there's nothing stopping the university from having a pension fund for postdocs. There's nothing stopping the university having a medical aid scheme for postdocs, but the postdocs cannot be on the staff medical aid scheme. So I think that's a misunderstanding. I think there are some universities that are exploring and have found solutions to that challenge. But I think that's something that where more clarity is needed. I think that the downside of the tax exempt status for postdocs, as I've added to the slide, is that they really struggle to access financial products, loans, things like cell phone contracts. All these things require postdocs to have a payslip, something as simple as a payslip. And postdocs should not be getting a payslip because they should not be on the payroll, at least not on the staff HR payroll. There may be a mirror system, and some universities do this. They run a parallel system for postdocs only, and in which case they may be able to produce such a proof of income. But without proof of income, postdocs often struggle to maneuver their way in the real world. Then the second issue around visas, just again to put it into context, we see that non-South African nationals make up a large portion of postdocs in South Africa. In 2022, it was 61% based on the institutional data. And then when we say institutional data, that's the data from that we collected from postdocs and from the universities themselves. And then based on the R&D surveys, it's 61%. So consistent across both data sets. If we look at other countries, having a large portion of international postdocs is common. In the Netherlands, up to 67%, and in the US, the average is 54%. So this is not a unique phenomenon to South Africa. If we break it down further, if we look at non-South African nationals and do that on the basis of postdocs from Africa outside of South Africa, so the rest of Africa and the rest of the world, we see that in the earlier years, postdocs were primarily coming from the rest of the world outside of Africa, but that has changed significantly. Many of our postdocs come from the rest of Africa at the moment, almost 8 out of 10. So Africa is a source of postdocs. You could argue that South Africa has become a postdoc hub for many PhD graduates from African countries. And of course, that raises the issue of visas. Anyone wishing to be in the country needs to be on the correct visa. There was a time when postdocs could get scarce skills visas. That's no longer the case. They're not supposed to be on student visas. The Department of Home Affairs is very clear on that. They're not students. There is a special visa category that they should apply for. And that the Department of Home Affairs argues would facilitate a lot of, or remove many of the delays and complaints that are faced. Of course, it's not a simple story because, as I alluded to earlier, if you're on a student visa, you are permitted to do some work. You're not allowed to do work if you're on the postdoc, the special visa. And so it's also sometimes the case that postdocs push to apply for a student visa so that they can then earn additional income. And then when they go to renew their visa, they run into problems. So those are two issues, and that I think always get a lot of attention when I do these kinds of presentations or attend them. But I'm going to stop there. I've been talking now for almost half an hour, which is way too long. And Sue, I'll hand back to you and open the floor for any comments and questions, and hopefully a productive discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Francois. And I do think if those of you who haven't read the guidelines, it's really worth engaging with. We've got lots of questions already coming up in the chat bar, and I'm also going to invite anyone who'd like to ask their questions to please just raise their hand somewhere at the bottom of your Zoom bar. I think it's under React. You'll find a space, or under More. You'll find a space that invites you to where to raise your hand. Otherwise, just put a comment into the chat bar if you can't find where to raise your hand. But in the meantime, let's tackle some of those questions that are already there in the chat bar. And one is from Louis Duplessis, which has sparked quite a lot of other people replying to it, where Louis asks, is it a requirement that postdocs have to produce 2 research outputs per year? To which I replied that that's entirely up to the university, what requirements they put on their postdocs. And a few others have said, that there's some debates about whether it's worth it to have postdocs in that purely sort of output sense of worth. I don't know if you want to comment on that issue.
Sure. So, I mean, the simple answer is, as Sue said, there is no requirement. Certainly not in the USAF policy, nor in the binding class ruling is there any reference to the type of research or the number of outputs or the type of outputs. Nothing like that appears. What has emerged, as you said, is at the university level, where what I suspect is happening is that, particularly at the management level, calculations are being made in terms of the publication subsidy. If we employ, or not employ because it's not legally correct, but if we offer a bursary to a postdoc and the value of that bursary is 240,000 Rand and they produce 2 publications, we will get from DHET, as long as they are in accredited journals, roughly about 250,000 Rand back. So there you can see in very simple maths how the institution may think about the outputs that are required from postdocs. Of course, how that money is distributed within the institution is a whole different story. So, I mean, I have a whole presentation on that. Different institutions remunerate their staff differently, and postdocs often aren't. They don't get a slice of the subsidy. That's certainly what I've experienced. So that money does make its way into the organization or into the university in some shape or form, but who actually gets what portion will vary greatly between universities. But you are right. If you look at the UJ policy, if I'm not mistaken, in fact, it's called a contract, it's not a policy. It requires two publications. So some institutions are insisting on 2 publications, and then some hosts will introduce certain requirements. So it may be, for example, that at one university, like at Stellenbosch, there's no requirement for number of publications, but a host may say the terms of my memorandum of understanding with you as my postdoc is that you will produce 2 publications per annum. So there are 2 places where this expectation can creep in and take effect.
And I guess there are dangers then in alongside so much of higher education, purely turning it into a metric where you might get publications, but they're rubbish publications, they're accredited outputs, but they actually don't build the field. And of course, publications are only one metric there is, as you pointed out, the possibility for postdocs to supervise, to mentor, and so on. And just to make clear that there are a number of universities where there is no reward to any academics for their publications. It's accepted that that's part of your job profile, so you don't get research rewards or other incentives. So yeah, very complex and obviously varies greatly by institution. I'm going to just jump to a question because I think it follows on before I go back to the earlier questions, and that is a question about the renewal of contracts. Given that if there is a requirement, you've got to have published X or Y, and many times that's not been possible because it takes so long and so on. What did your research tell us about what happens then when students haven't, or when the postdoc fellows haven't met the internally agreed upon output requirements?
My experience tells me, but a lot of people on the call, so they might have different experiences, and I think it'd be good to hear from them. But my experience is that it will often depend on the host. So the host would be understanding and say, okay, I realize there were delays for reasons that were beyond your control. So I think renewals do take place even if deliverables haven't been met. But I think what's really dangerous is when we have, I think if you look at the NHIS, NIHSS postdocs, so humanities and social sciences postdocs, they require a certain number of publications within, I think, 2 years, and don't take into account, I think, many of the processes that researchers need to go through before they can publish. So there's a lack of understanding of the research process by those that are offering the bursaries, and I think that is an area that certainly requires attention. I don't need to tell anyone who works in the social sciences and humanities about how long it can take to collect data in the field, how many things can be beyond your control, how long it can take to get ethics clearance, for example. That alone can cost you months. So it's not always easy just to produce 2 articles a year. And I think that is due to a lack of understanding of the research process. So on one hand, you could say, well, then postdocs shouldn't accept these positions. They should just say, well, that's just impossible. I can't accept these terms. But I think we know that, there are many more PhDs being produced. Some successfully transition into the workplace outside of academia, but many want to remain in academia and see the postdoc as a bridge, and so feel obliged to take on these contracts or offers, despite the demands that are unrealistic. So I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, thanks. It of course opens another whole lot of lines of conversation, which maybe we'll have time to pick up on. But in the meantime, I want to jump to some of the other comments. Well, firstly, I just want to point out, thank you, Shala. She's posted the latest SARS legislation from June 2025. It doesn't change anything, though, from previous rulings, not that I can see. But a question that's come up in various forms in the chat has been around this issue of payments. That is the one issue in the guidelines that has your red exclamation mark to say that your guidelines recommend that payments happen at a set time and a monthly basis, whereas SARS seems to allow or recommend quarterly payments. I wonder if you can speak to that issue. That's a really hot topic for our postdocs.
Yeah. So you're right. The USAF policy actually, I think, provides for 2 different payment periods. And for some reason, and I wasn't there at the time, I don't know what the thinking was, but they differentiated between externally funded and internally funded or institutionally funded postdocs. And for one of them, I can't remember which way around, they were supposed to be paid biannually, so twice a year, and for the other, quarterly. So we feel, and most people in the community, and I think postdocs themselves too, feel that that is not a reasonable way to proceed. And the reasons for that are multiple, depending on which side of the payment you are. If you're the university who's making the payment, the problem with making big bulk payments is that postdocs sometimes disappear. They leave for whatever reason. might be a fallout with a host, maybe a family issue. It could be several issues. Now, if you've paid in advance for 6 months, then there's a big risk for the university, or even quarterly. So from the university's point of view, it would prefer to pay monthly. And of course, from the postdoc's position, it's the same challenge. You know, if you get paid in chunks of money, you have to be really good at managing your money. You have to be careful not to overspend. So monthly makes planning easier, makes it a little bit budgeting more straightforward, etc. So we have recommended monthly. I think most universities pay monthly, but it isn't strictly in keeping with the directive. Now, at one of the forums that we had, I think it was the one in Pretoria that UNISA hosted, we had a tax expert speak to the forum, and he made what I think is quite a good recommendation. He said universities should think about what the postdoc looks like to SARS. In other words, if SARS were to look at the postdoc and how they're paid and how they're treated, how they're managed by the university, if it looks like their staff, there's a problem. If, however, it doesn't look as if they're staff, then there's no problem. And so the reason I mention that is that I think there is some flexibility, like changing the payment frequency, that doesn't materially change the way that postdocs are treated. They're not therefore like staff just because they pay it monthly. If they were put on the staff medical aid scheme, that would look very different. That would look to SARS like this person is employed. If they have an employment contract, if tax is deducted from them, all these things are things that raise red flags for SARS. So we have, as you pointed out, in certain places indicated that this isn't in alignment, but we don't think it's something that would necessarily upset, if we want to put it in those terms, SARS, and result in the university falling foul of SARS, which I think is happening increasingly. A lot of universities are quite nervous about being audited and then falling on the wrong side of SARS, which no one wants.
No, indeed. None of us want that. Now look, there's a few more questions, but just a reminder to everyone, if you would like to chip in so that you don't just have to hear our voices, please feel free to put up your hand or to indicate in the chat that you'd like to do so. Quite an interesting conversation taking place between Bhavisha Kovaji and Max Spies, and this is about the number of years that you can have a postdoc. And Max is saying that the SARS mentions the SARS document that Shala just shared mentions a 5-year period. I wonder if you can comment a little bit more around that issue of how many and where and so on. Does it matter if it's in different universities? Can you just keep being a postdoc as long as you can find the funding?
So I was just waiting for someone to stop banging on the roof. So I was just trying to find, while you were asking the question, the actual piece of text in the USAF policy. My reading of the policy is that there's nothing that says you cannot be a postdoc for longer than 5 years. It's implied through certain wording about the renewal of contracts. When it talks about renewal, it seems to assume that a postdoc will be appointed for no longer than 5 years, but it doesn't explicitly say that. So my reading is that you can be a postdoc for as long as you want, but universities are concerned about serialization, as it's often called, of postdocs. And postdocs being postdocs for 14 years, 15 years, and just not being able to get into a permanent or contract post at the university. So my understanding there isn't, but I am aware that some universities are starting to impose that 5-year limit. That's certainly the case at Stellenbosch. I've exceeded it. There's no way I can get another postdoc appointment because I've exceeded the 5 years. So I think it's one of those where institutions will make decisions based on what they believe is in the interest both of themselves and the postdoc, obviously. But my reading of the directive and the use of policy is that there's no term limit. So
Yeah.
as long as you can bring in funding, you're likely to, or you are able to renew your term.
Keep going. Yeah. Yeah. And I think the only reference in the SARS document is about you having to have been within 5 years of graduating in order
Exactly, and
to
that's often misinterpreted
start.
as
Okay.
5 years maximum, but it's not that.
Right. Thank you. Situmo Motlong, can I give the microphone to you, please? Shala, I don't know if you can unmute Situmo.
It's on it now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'm not so sure. I just want to confirm if you can hear me or not, please.
Yes, we can hear you well. Thanks, Situmo.
Thank you very much. Let me just acknowledge a very informative talk that is being given here. And however, I do have 2 questions, and I'm not so sure whether you will allow me to ask them. And I've already posted them on the chat box. The first one is the issue of the policy. I'm not so sure why it is so compulsory to actually advertise the postdoc position. That's my first question, based on the fact that, for example, if I'm going to be the mentor of the postdoc, sometimes we meet with these people during the conferences, and then we find it very important to say this can be a my postdoc. So now the issue of making advertisement, to me, it seems as if it is going to be a waste of time, because the mentor already knows whom am I going to take. So now, even if there can be some interviews in the panel, if you are not going to take this one that I'm saying, I want this one, then I might even change to say, no, I'm not going to take a postdoc. So why it is so important to actually advertise? Because to me, it doesn't make sense. And the second question is the issue of the salary threshold in terms of the stipend. I think the policy is not clear in terms of how much is the threshold before the stipend can be subjected to the tax, to sales tax. So I'm not so sure if my questions are clear. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So just to address your first question about advertising, I'll read to you from the USAF policy, which is attached to the binding clause ruling. It says the relevant host, academic host department, must advertise such an opportunity in order to comply with the SARS regulations governing, and then in open inverted commas, open bursaries, close, and the existing university policy for the payment of bursaries awarded by the departments. So it's very clear in the USAF policy that the positions must be advertised. So that's doesn't provide, or provide some rationale. It wants it to be open, it wants it to be competitive. So it wants to avoid a selection by a host of a particular candidate. And I understand what you're saying in terms of finding the appropriate person, especially in an environment where maybe there's a shortage of skills, but that's how it reads. So it's quite clear. Of course, and this is a little bit off topic, but we see it in university departments when it comes to writing the job specification. Academics are getting clever and writing very, very, very specific job specifications. And the reason they do that, as long as it gets past the dean and past HR, is it narrows the field and it basically starts to point to a particular candidate. So that's one way. I'm not advocating for this, but it is one way to get around it, but it must be advertised and must be open. Everyone should be able to apply. The question about the remuneration, it's very clear there should be no tax on a postdoc's bursary amount. It doesn't matter what the amount is. It doesn't matter if it's 1 million or 10 rand. It should not be taxed. The only time tax comes into play is when postdocs do additional work, and they are permitted in terms of the policy to do 12 hours a week of additional work. But that's only in the case of South African postdocs, because they are permitted to work. Non-South African postdocs are not permitted to work, so they're not entitled to work those 12 hours and therefore cannot earn any additional income. The South African postdocs that earn the additional income, that income must go through HR and must be taxed at whatever the correct rate is for the amount of income that they receive. This could be income for teaching or for doing field work, whatever the case may be. It doesn't stipulate an hourly amount. It simply says 12 hours. So just to be clear, there's no tax and there's no maximum amount that a postdoc can be offered. I hope that answers the question.
Sure, that's something I wasn't even aware of. So I'm on the lookout for R1 million or dollar, preferably postdoc. So if any of them become available, yeah, let me know. There's a few more questions in the chat, but I'm going to hand over to Priscilla from down the road at NMU. Over to you, Priscilla.
Hi, Sue. Hi, Francois. Thanks for this very engaging conversation. I want to follow up from Francois's response about fellows, because I think some people in the system are now understanding what is required from international fellows and the fact that under this special visa, they are not permitted to work. What happens with international fellows who have provided a service without the awareness of this directive and are expecting payment? How do universities remain compliant? Thank you.
Oh, that's a tough question. I'm not a legal advisor, but I would say my first port of call would be to ask the legal team at the university and perhaps to engage with SARS and say this has happened, and come clean rather than to try and hide it, because ultimately it might come back to bite the postdoc in the future when they look for work opportunities. If they've transgressed the terms of their visa and this comes to the attention of Department of Home Affairs, I think that would be to a huge disadvantage. But I understand what you're saying. These things happen and they're not always deliberate. Postdocs might not be aware. They might be offered additional money and have no idea that this is not permitted. So yeah, Priscilla, I'm not giving you the answer you want, but I think probably this is the kind of thing where, hopefully a community of practice, and the community of practice, I know it's hard, but if we can get, and we have managed to get Department of Home Affairs at the table and other government partners to be part of the conversation, then hopefully these kinds of issues can be addressed and resolved more quickly.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. It's clear that there is a bit of a lack of clarity and people may well get caught in the middle. On your comment about the community of practice that developed the guidelines, there's a question from Shepo, and thank you to Stephanie and Melvin. I see your hands up. I will get to you shortly. But Shepo Malloy, asks about the need for a postdoc society or association so that postdoctoral fellows can get support across institutions. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, so there are some universities that have postdoc societies. Certainly, I know at Stellenbosch, Pretoria, UNISA, UJ do have postdoc societies, and there is some talk about creating a national structure. But I think without more societies at the institutions, the national structure is not yet going to be that representative. So I think there's work to be done at the ground level in terms of postdocs, creating these societies. One of the challenges, and I'm just going to be completely open and honest about this, is that postdocs are there for a year, 2 years, 3 years, unless you're a serial postdoc. Most don't stay on for very long. And so creating an organizational structure becomes very difficult under those conditions, because people are coming and going. So you lose a lot of the experience, expertise about how to deal with organization, which, as any academic on the call will know, requires some expertise and sometimes some creativity. So it's not easy to hold a society together. And what I certainly witnessed at Stellenbosch, having been on the society, is that the society then becomes kind of like an events and social coordinator, which has its own benefits. I'm not saying that shouldn't happen. it certainly creates cohesion and can create networking opportunities. But what it doesn't do is create a clear line of communication between postdocs and whatever the structure is at the university that needs to know what their issues and grievances and feedback is. So I think the national society is good in principle, but I think there's more work to be done at the institution.
Yeah, and I guess that's a real call to all of us online to look at what we have in place in our own institutions. Stephanie, I wonder if you want to come in. I know you've got some really positive experience of working with postdocs.
Yeah, I have listened to I have looked at the guidelines, of course, and listened to all of the discussion, and maybe I can just say for the information of people who are here, I have experience of having run postdoctoral programs and been a deputy vice chancellor, so I understand all of the logistics and the issues around organization and contracts and so on. But what I wanted to say a bit about today was really that I know postdocs very often feel unappreciated, and that they feel insecure and uncertain, but they are appreciated. If you take a look at how the universities are expanding their postdoctoral programs, increasing the number of postdocs. I know several universities are at the moment trying to increase the number of postdocs that they have in their institutions. And that's not because, it's not because they're viewed as cheap labor. They actually aren't cheap labor, but they make a tremendous contribution. For this reason, when you come out of a doctoral degree, you've just made an original contribution at the frontiers of knowledge of your discipline or your field. So you come as a postdoc, as an expert, an international expert, and that contribution is appreciated by universities, because that's a great way of expanding the impact of the research that the university is doing. So they bring expertise, they bring the knowledge, often very specialized knowledge, and I think that they should not feel that that's not appreciated. Universities do appreciate that that's the value of a postdoc. And in return for that, as Francois said earlier, it's a kind of a bridge between the PhD, which has been a very focused study, into the world of academia and an opportunity to gain experience and to play a role very often in a team. I come from the natural sciences and engineering, so I am more experienced in terms of fields where you need laboratory, you need instrumentation, you need a team around you, and postdocs get the benefit of that. They can be a part of a team. Very often, they're an invaluable leader in the team. But they have a host, they have a mentor, supervisor, different universities call it different things, but somebody who is the senior academic who serves as their host in the team or in the laboratory or in the research group. And they can work with that supervisor to gain experience, to make contributions, and to add to their publication record, often with the research being subsidized. So the research fellow is not required to pay for all the research costs. They become a part of the team and they make their contribution, but they don't have to pay for all their own research costs. So there's a benefit in two directions there. And the point that I want to make, I could go for a long time on this, but I'll stop now. But the point I want to make is that it is intended to be, and it should really be seen, at least partly, as a kind of win-win relationship. It's, Francois, I hope you're not rolling your eyes at that.
No, I have some thoughts, but I'm not rolling my eyes.
I really do think we should be looking at that in terms of how we can kind of make it better in terms of the getting past all of the logistics and the institutional issues, and making I think one of the ways to do that is to make them completely transparent. so that postdocs understand what it's all about. But to make the point that this is actually a beneficial situation. Universities gain tremendously from their expertise, and the postdocs have time to build up their research expertise. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Yeah, so huge benefits to all of us. I must say, I do think that the way in which universities often talk about postdocs is part of why they feel like they're just a cog in a machine. And I think we need to draw on much more positive framing of their role as members of a research community, as leaders in the research community, and that language that you just used.
Can
Melvin.
I just respond to that, Sue? Because
Yes,
I know
please.
I was, Stephanie thought I was rolling my eyes, but I wasn't. I was just thinking. I think that, and I learned this from University of Pretoria, that we often treat all postdocs as one group. And postdocs come from very different paths. They have different levels of experience. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And what they've done at Pretoria, which I'm not saying every university should or can do, but is to have levels of postdocs. They have a junior postdoc and they have a senior postdoc. And a junior postdoc is someone who's just finished a PhD and then might have a very different path and set of expectations and requirements for their next 2 years. That's very different from someone who may be older, who maybe has done a few postdocs before, or that did 2 PhDs or 2 masters and then a PhD. So in other words, has a lot more experience and should be recognized for that, can be left alone a lot more, can be given the independence, whereas the other type, if you want to call it that, needs more guidance. So I think that's something for people to think about, not to treat postdocs as this homogenous group. And then just to add to what Stephanie said, it's something that I'm reading up about at the moment. It's not something I'm very familiar with because I'm not an economist, but there is also a line of thinking that the way postdocs are engaged or connected to the university is actually more normal than we think. That the idea of a permanent job and tenure and these types of labor are something that is abnormal, that is emerged in modern society and that is not sustainable. So that takes us to the point that my colleague Palesa really pushes hard on, is that postdocs have to develop skills that allow them to move into the marketplace outside of academia and not always assume that there is a path straight into academia. Of course, there should be a path, it shouldn't be excluded, but it's not a path for everyone. But then postdocs with the university need to work together to make those sort of exits from academia more possible. And this goes to exactly what Stephanie said about expectations, being clear on both sides. Thanks.
Thank you. We've got Melvin's hand up and Irvine's hand up. Melvin, your hand has come down. Would you like to chat? Melvin Omar, I think that Shaila's in charge of unmuting people. Melvin, there's 2 Melvins. Maybe unmute both of them. And we'll see if Melvin still has a question. And in the absence of that, or while we're waiting for Melvin, let us ask Irvine Langton. Let's hear from you.
Thank you so much, Chair. Thank you so much, Doc. The presentation was so informative. Yeah, I've got basically a comment, maybe, a comment vis-a-vis a question. I heard Francois saying, there are special visas for those international postdoc fellows. And those are not allowed to work, if I heard him correctly, about the 12 hours, whatever extra work that probably the university might deem necessary for the postdoc to engage into as far as working. Then we have got the locals who are probably South Africans. Yes, they can get that 12 hours space to work. Then my question is, we have got people who have got work permits, one, from from foreign countries and also those with permanent residence. So in most cases, universities stereotype everyone from outside to say they are foreigners. I think there should be an education to, most of these universities to say someone with a work permit is eligible to work in South Africa. Someone with a permanent res is also eligible to those 12 hours of working, because from a bit of my experience, we are stereotyped to say you are foreigners, when it comes to, working under the postdoc program. Then the last comment, what I also think is there should be a national standard that, should be applied to all universities in terms of what postdocs are supposed to be doing. Because, when we left it to the university, of course, yes, universities do different things, but generally there should be some monitoring and evaluation standard, maybe under the DHET, at least to enforce, some of the standard things that affect postdoctoral fellows. So that's my comment. I feel like maybe in your next research there should be some standard that run across all universities, in as much as universities differ in terms of operations and management. Thank you so much, Francois. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Francois.
No, I mean, all I can say is, it depends on what the visa is in your passport, and that determines. And I think you're probably right that there's sometimes resistance, certainly from the university in terms of dealing with postdocs from outside of South Africa. I think that applies to academic posts too. We sometimes see a resistance to have to deal with the amount of paperwork that is associated with appointing someone from outside of South Africa. But there's nothing that says that you cannot appoint someone from outside South Africa. So there's a different reason behind that. And I think this creates a lot of bias, and even what Jonathan Jansen writes about academic xenophobia. So I think there are big risks there. And I completely agree that there needs to be more alignment. That's what this whole process is about. It is difficult to get those government departments to the table, and I think that is what what we need. We need the universities talking to Department of Home Affairs on a regular basis. And unfortunately, the way I experienced this process was the only way to get to the Department of Home Affairs was through someone who knew someone who knew someone. And often in South Africa, things work like that. You can't write to Department of Home Affairs and invite them. You won't get a response. But if you know someone who knows someone, they might just turn up. And we had someone who came on more than one occasion and made things very, very, very clear. So that kind of engagement is definitely needed, but not so easy to enact, I suppose.
No, absolutely. I do think that we need to collectively, as an academic community, really engage with our home affairs. As you said, it's not just postdocs, it's also staff members. And so we have this real discord between the academic xenophobia that seems to be involved in visas, and yet we have an internationalization policy that speaks about the importance of having international staff and students if we are to be cutting edge, world-class higher education. So we've got this real sort of clash of understandings. I have seen a few comments, and I wonder if I can just put those to you around some of the perhaps more negative experiences of postdocs. And we know about this certainly from the literature. So we've got someone saying, I'm going to try and find the comment, someone saying, it's Boba Ismaila, saying that most South African universities don't have a policy for absorption of postdocs. They don't have a path for them. We have someone else saying that postdocs are not given much attention, but they are expected to be workhorses. We've got Marcina Singh saying, you know, that the hosts need to be given training because they're often very bad at it and they're not clued up on the policies, the requirements, and they see them as workhorses rather than as individuals who are meant to be mentored. So those kinds of comments, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and I've heard them in my own institution. I've never been to a university where I haven't heard that to some extent, which is why I'm so in favor of forming postdoc committees and spaces and spaces of solidarity. But I wonder if you can speak back to some of those issues.
Yeah, I think, and I touched on it very briefly when I was presenting. The role of the host, I think, is something that we don't look at often enough. That's really where most of the power vests in that relationship. There are hosts that will ride roughshod over any university policies and will do as they please because they're powerful in the institution. They bring in normally a lot of money or they have a high reputation. So they're not going to bow to institutional policies. So that is a really difficult position to be in. And I've personally spoken to many postdocs who have had experiences where their hosts deny them opportunities to develop. And I'll give an example, someone who wanted to go on a project management course and the host just said no, flat out no, or attend a postdoc conference, flat out no. So I think a lot of it does sit at the host level. Now, I mean, it's very easy to say, let's train the hosts. I'm not sure how easy that's going to be. You know, academics are not always responsive to being told what to do. I think the solution lies more in the negotiation process before you take on the post. Again, being very clear about the expectations of your host, having things in writing, having clear expectations, and sometimes, you know, go in with a colleague or an advisor when you talk to the host, but ask, make things clear, so that you know what, as a postdoc, what awaits you. I'm not saying it's going to make all problems go away, but I think that's the better starting point is for postdocs to be more clear about what they can expect and to negotiate that with hosts from the outset. And then you know, I want to add, because it does kind of pick up on a point that Stephanie made. These things happen everywhere. They're not just happening in universities. They happen in all workplaces where there are conflicts between, you know, senior and junior, temporary and permanent staff. So it's not unique to the university. These are often people issues, and so I think, you know, to your point, Sue, about having support, having whatever structures those may be, are probably really needed to resolve these kinds of issues. I've seen at universities, you know, fallouts between hosts and postdocs, and there's no one to deal with it, basically. You know, it goes from the dean to HR. HR says nothing to do with us because they're not employed by the university, so postdocs don't fall under our remit. So then it's back with the dean, and then it's with the DVC research, and so there often isn't a clear place for disputes and issues to be resolved around postdocs. And that isn't the same for students, and it isn't the same for staff. So postdocs do, in this case, I think, fall between stools and are in a, I'm not saying they're not valued, but I think they are in a particularly vulnerable position.
Yeah, thank you. Some very clear calls to action going on here. Spaces of solidarity between the postdocs, much more clarity needed. And I think a lot of that has to happen at the institutional level. Karina, would you like to ask your question? Karina Kleinhans. No? Karina? Okay, having problems with some microphones there. Let's try Melvin instead.
I'm sorry. It seems
Melvin.
as, can you hear me
Oh, there
now?
we go. Yes, we can hear you. Hi, Karina.
I just want to know, what is your view on remote postdocs? Has anyone had experience with it? Does it work?
So my sense of it, and others can chip in and they might disagree, but, you know, as with staff, I think COVID did shake things up a bit, because I was part of a panel that selected postdocs and appointed postdocs during COVID, and of course they worked remotely. It wasn't possible for them to travel to take up their positions. And so the same happened with staff. They worked from home, and then when COVID came to an end, there was a sense of, but it's possible. So why do we have to be at the office 5 days a week? At least opened up that question. But my sense is that postdocs will be required to be on campus, because it would be the expectation of most universities, with the exception of UNISA and maybe one or two other institutions, that it is a full-time and full contact, if you want to call it that. I don't know if that's the right term. It sounds like I'm talking about rugby, but they should be on campus and be integrated into the organization. And I think that is important. And I can't believe I'm saying this, because I don't like to go onto campus. I like to work from home. I feel a lot more productive, and sitting in a car is not. But there are certain benefits to going onto campus, being in an office, and Stephanie mentioned lab work and being part of a team, for example, and learning how to work in a team, how organizations work, become socialized as an academic, asking a colleague about what journal to publish, and all these very soft things that happen in spaces that we share, that we lose out on if we work from home. So in the end, my answer is probably a balance between the two. Some remote, some on-site, depending on the kind of research that you do, and depending on the expectations of your host.
Yeah,
Thank you.
So many dependings there. Depends on the discipline, depends on the role, depends on many things. So I think we need to avoid any blanket rulings around that, and so much else. But yeah, there's so much that happens in person, isn't there? So much thinking that somehow is facilitated by being in the same room. Melvin, let's try you again. If you are able to unmute yourself, let's give it a try. Melvin. Really battling to unmute. Melvin, it would seem that if you can't unmute, you might have to type your question into the chat bar.
Okay.
Here we go. We can
It's
hear
me,
you.
actually.
Yay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
It's Saibit.
Oh, it's Sabit. Oh, okay.
Sorry for that. I just wanted to say that there's been some talk regarding the payment of international postdocs, where there is a problem with special visitors' visas, which does not allow them to work. My discussion with our international person says here that if you offer, when you're designing and writing your offer letter, you should specify that the postdocs will be given an opportunity to teach for 12 hours. That would allow them to work and be paid in the university. If it is specified in the visa. So the idea here is to inform Home Affairs that the visa should specify that 12 hours are permissible for work. I haven't tested this, but that's what I'm getting. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that, but as I said, I think to one of the previous questions, I think if your visa says X, then that's what applies. So if you can negotiate that in your visa, then that is possible. I'm not an administrator, so I again take this under advisement. But what I have seen happen in some cases is it is permissible, and there is reference to this in the policy about topping up your postdoc bursary. So in other words, if you're offered a bursary of 200,000, it is possible to top up your bursary by another 30,000. And that might be a workaround for remunerating postdocs, for example, teaching or marking or whatever the case may be. But I think that's something that the administrators would need to verify as being possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important workaround that I know a number of universities are doing, because as far as I know, that Section 11 visitors visa makes clear that you may not work at all if you get that postdoc visa. So you're not even allowed to do the normal hours that a South African postdoc can do. But if you appointed someone as a postdoc, instead of paying them, I'm just making up figures now, but instead of paying them 200,000, you pay them 300,000, and counted as part of your postdoctoral development program is some teaching or whatever. That's not counted as work. It's part of your program. I think that's the workaround that a lot of universities are using. I'm not sure where SARS or where Home Affairs would stand on that, but that's, I think, how a lot of universities have navigated this, to say that this is not extra work. This is part of the postdoctoral program that they're expected to participate in. We did have someone's hand up, and I see it has vanished. I don't know if there was someone else waiting to talk. Velma. Hi, Velma. Would you like to unmute yourself?
There we go. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, Francois. How are you?
I'm good, and you?
Hi, colleagues. So yeah, I appreciate the dialogue of maybe the workaround, because that is a serious issue about the international postdoctoral fellows on the visitor's visa. I have gotten very clear instruction from the Department of Home Affairs, specifically Deputy Director Mr. Mbele, that said they are not allowed to work. And if you look at the definition of work within the Immigration Act, it says to be employed. So this is something I'm very concerned, but it's difficult, where SARS says you can work, but you have to have the right work permit. And Department of Home Affairs very specifically says you're not allowed to work. And now it creates that hot topic, Francois, that you talked about. And I was just interested in finding out how other universities navigate, but that's kind of why my hand went up and down, because every time I have the question, someone makes a good point. So it's a very difficult scenario in our institutions. So really not a question, but just a comment that it's a major issue.
Yeah, an absolutely major issue with the lack of clarity. So I think you're quite right, Velma. We're all trying to find workarounds, whereas actually we probably need to go to the source of the problem. And as Francois said, organizing that meeting at a sector level, more powerful than me more powerful people than me would have to make that happen. Thank you for that comment, an important issue. Okay, I think we are coming to the end of our session, and it has been indeed a very useful conversation. If we achieve nothing else, at least we are all now aware of the existence of these guidelines. As Francois said, it's not a policy, it's guidelines, but it really does sort of set out some good advice to universities, and looks at perhaps some of the inconsistencies between what already exists at a national and at an institutional level. I'm certainly taking away from this a really clear call to ensure that our postdocs, that there is an institutional structure, whether it's an informal club, whether it's a more formal political space of a voice in the structures. It's very clear that our postdocs need something that is more than our current fairly ad hoc arrangements. Francois, thank you so much for your input. Are there any last words that you would like to have?
No, just to say thank you again for the opportunity. And I think, this keeps the conversation going. And, Velma didn't make it wasn't a question, but a comment, but others heard, and now I can go away and think about, maybe the top up is a solution, and, reach out to colleagues and find ways to make things work. I think I often say my favorite administrators are the ones that say yes, not the ones that start with no. And I think there's a lot of space to improve things for postdocs if they do add the value that they do. And I think this very discussion takes us forward in that regard. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next seminar. Keep well. Bye-bye, everyone.